amazing opportunity for us to download and to see what students are actually doing. At the same time, I think, especially within the UK, I don't know what it's like in Australia. There is increased availability of so-called learner data. So in the United Kingdom, how students are performing in primary schools, all that data is linked to how students are performing in secondary school, and that is then being linked with how well students are doing in tertiary education, like vocational training or university education, and that is increasingly linked with how students are performing then in the labor market. So by linking learner data about the actual learner over time, you increasingly in the UK get a perspective of which schools are doing well, which schools are doing not so well, and which teachers in a way are doing well. So irrespective of whether we're using fine-grained learning analytics data, an increasing amount of data is being linked. And I think the third big trend, of course, is the ubiquitous presence of technology. That's why we're here. But I think the fourth trend, which is interesting, is that we haven't yeah, I totally agree with you, Tim. That is a highly charged political statement. And I think we have to unpack this. These are trends that we see in the market, but of course we as researchers then and as practitioners have to see, okay, how do we deal with these trends? I think a fourth potentially politically difficult trend is the formal and informal learning boundaries have become increasingly blurred. I mean, in the old days, you went to school from 9 to 3 or 9 to 4, and then you went home and you did a little bit of homework, and that's it. But increasingly, of course, there's so much amazing materials and learning opportunities out there online. And the question in a way is, okay, how are students actually learning? Are they primarily learning inside the classroom, or are they learning primarily outside the classroom? So there is also a big question in a way, okay, how do we capture that kind of informal learning space that students are learning in? And I think a fifth trend, which is perhaps slightly controversial as well, is that there is actually an increased interest of, I would call, non-educationalists, so to understand learning, because there is because of the first four trends. There's an increasing group of researchers who don't necessarily have an educational background, who are just mining that data because there's an increasing amount of data available. And at the same time, there are big for-profit companies starting to emerge, like Pearson. We're starting with the University of Pearson and Newton, and they're starting to mine all this amazing data. And at the same time, I think there is on a student perspective, there is an increasing expectation of personalization and flexibility. So increasingly, students are expecting that we adjust their learning experience on their needs. So what I'm highlighting on a kind of big level is that maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but in the next 4 or 5 years, increasingly this 6 power trends will increasingly start to influence the shape of education. And within that shaping of education, I think that's where I think learning design can play a very big role. So what I would hope to like to talk to you today about is learning design. But learning design and learning analytics is, by its definition, very messy. So it's not only politically difficult, and I think what Matthew is saying, that yes, a lot of learning doesn't occur online. So some of the data that you're collecting is not necessarily the data that students are actually portraying. So what you in a way get is that in order to really unpack what's happening in learning, it is messy. And I guess one way to overcome that messiness of big data is to look at actually what are our teachers actually designing for our students. And if we can unpack what teachers are designing for our students, then perhaps we can get a better understanding of all that complex and big data. What I sometimes refer to as learning design allows you to do a kind of brain scan of what teachers are intending their students to do. So Grenier Connolly in 2012 defined learning design as a methodology for enabling teachers and designers to make informed decisions on how to go about designing learning activities and interventions. which pedagogically informed and make effective use of resource and technology. This is a quite nice but quite dry statement. So let's have a look at a practical example what that means for the Open University. I'm not entirely sure if you can see this. This looks quite small, but and I apologize for this. So at the Open University, we have seven different learning activities. From the left, the more kind of traditional assimilative activities, which is basically what I'm doing now. I'm talking to you, which in a way is not good practice, but I will hopefully focus more on communication and starting to focus more on productive activities. And on the right-hand side, you see typical assessment activities. And the middle part is a kind of more student-empowered activities like finding information, communication, productive, experiential, and interactive. So to give you a kind of a concrete example of what our teachers are designing, and this will look again quite small, so I do apologize for this. So you might have to zoom into this. So this is a computer course. I'm going to zoom in myself as well. So in this particular computer course, in week 1, students are expected to spend 10 hours doing assimilative activities, so reading and watching particular kind of information about this particular course, and they are expected to spend 1.5 hours on finding information. And there's a little bit of work, and on average they're supposed to work for 13.3 hours in week 1, and then in week 2 and in week 3 they have other activities, and in week 4 the teacher has decided to do nothing for the students, so the students are not expected to work in that week. And the reason that he designed this was that in the 4th week there is a very authentic assignment that students have to work on in terms of programming a particular piece of code that actually works, and that programming of that particular piece of code is then also assessed. So in that particular week, students are expected to work 35 hours. And then the fundamental question is that good design? Is that appropriate? And Lauren asked if students see this overview. Yes, we do share this with students. Yeah, the question in a way is, okay, do students actually take notice? And what I find the beauty of linking learning design with learning analytics, we can then start to test, is that particular design that that teacher had in mind, is it actually a good thing? Or potentially it might distract certain groups of students. So what we are trying to do at the Open University and is to link all these big data sets together. So what we've been doing is we've mapped over 300 modules at the Open University, how our teachers are designing courses, so the kind of brain scan of teachers. And then we've linked this with what students are actually doing. On 140 modules, we linked it on a weekly basis. And on 37 modules, we now have very fine-grained data, so actually seeing where students are clicking on a day-by-day basis. And then we've also linked this what students are actually experiencing. So we've asked students about whether they liked the course and whether they liked the design. And we've linked this with academic performance. And recently, we've also started to link this with predictive analytics data. So I will show you the remainder of the session. I will primarily show you all this big data set what we have found thus far with over 100,000 students. So are you guys still with me? Yes. Okay. Cool. So let's make it more interactive. So I will stop talking. So let me show you the Open University. This is the Open University UK. So what I mean, this is a fascinating box plot. So what does the Open University look like? If you would have to explain, if you would have to put it into a chat, what does the Open University look like? So maybe to explain a little bit, and I won't give away the clue. So on the left-hand side, there is assimilative reading and watching. Yes, so Carmen says it's mostly delivering content with lots of reading, as Lauren says, with some assessment. So there is one module on the left, not to be shamed, 53, that has nearly 90% of activities that students are expected to do is just reading. While, for example, on the right-hand side, module 57 has nearly 80% of assessment. So the question in a way is that good? And what you see in the middle is many of the modules hardly have any kind of interactive experiences or communication or experiential activities. But there are some modules that have really really interactive design. So we can then start to see, okay, does this actually matter? So the next that I'm going to show you is 3 different courses, and what I would like you to indicate in the chat is which of the 3 courses you would like to actually study if you would be a student at our Open University. So what you see here is a visualization of the weekly activities that our students are expected to do. And the yellow orangey color is assimilative activities, the blue is assessment, the pinky color is productive, and the green is communication. So just put in a vote, 1, 2, or 3. Which course would you like to study based on what you see in the course? Okay, we have lots of 2s. Everyone wants to study 2 because it's business and law, of course. Oh, 3. Cassandra goes for 3. Could anyone? Yeah. So Matthew says 2 looks more balanced and regular. So for those who indicated number 3, why would you want to study number 3? Yeah, it's subject area, and it's about languages and education. It's about lots of productive. There's a limited amount of change to get my head around. Yeah. Okay. So it is also what really interesting. What you see here is these are first year introductory modules. And in one module, basically the second one, there is a consistent workload of 15 hours, while in this third module, there is only like 6, 7 hours a week. So you wonder, like, how can it be that in the same level, how can it be that there's such a variation? But at the same time, I mean, it's interesting that I think no one has selected module 1, or Lauren has selected module 1 and Robin. I mean, the question in a way is, okay, this seems very weird if you suddenly have to do like 20, 25 hours in one particular week in week 10. So yeah, and Tim writes a good comment about, like, this seems to be like an aspiration of a designer, but is this really what students want? And I think this is the beauty of learning design, that if we see how teachers are designing courses, we can then see, okay, how are students actually doing over time? So what we are doing as a team is to look at the kind of designs that our teachers are designing. So on the left-hand side of the column, whether it's more so-called constructivist learning design, so kind of traditional online courses, or whether it is more focused on assessment and assessment in the wider sense of the word, so more formative and more summative activities, or whether it's perhaps more productive activity, so just doing stuff, or finally whether it's more kind of a social constructivist learning design where we work together. And with those kind of learning designs, we can then start to see, okay, how are students engaging in the VLE? Are they satisfied with this, and to what extent does this actually help us to address student retention? So what I'm going to show you again in a similar way is the computer science course, which I showed previously. So the next curve basically is this computer science course where if you remember, in week 4, the teacher indicated, okay, students can do nothing because they don't have to, because they're preparing for their particular course. But a new thing which is visualized in this visualization is the red curve, and the red curve is the average time that our students are spending in the virtual learning environment. So the question to you is, in a way, is how teachers design courses, does that link to what students are doing on average in the virtual learning environment? And I will come back to Matthew's question in a minute, which is, I think, is a very good question. So is there a link between how teachers are designing courses and the time that students are spending in the virtual learning environment based on this graph? Is it yes or no, or perhaps what do you think? Either you're thinking or you the question is not clear. Yeah, so the question is there a link between the red line, which is the average VLE activities, what students are doing, and how teachers are designing courses? So Hazel says yes, and Alan says yes. I mean, it is really interesting. For example, if we look at this week 4, in week 4, where students are not expected to basically spend time online, they nonetheless have the second highest peak of activities. So that is quite interesting. So the teacher thinks, okay, they have a week to practice their programming, but lots of students are spending a lot of time uh, on the VLE, and I think. Yeah, I mean, it is also interesting that, as Linda says, at the end of the course, there's a lot of engagement at that particular time when there is this big assessment. So, of course, these are aggregate pictures. It doesn't necessarily indicate what students are doing on an individual basis. But I'm just going to whiz you through a couple of other examples. So this is another course where you can see more or less every time when there is an assessment, there is lots of visualization. Sorry, lots of VLE engagement. And this is another course where, in a way, you can quite nicely see, for example, in this one, that the peak in workload is in week 21, while the assessment is in week 22. So from a learning design point of view, you wonder, okay, why is there a potential mismatch between when students are spending most of their time and when the teacher are expecting to spend their time. So Matthew makes a fair point about maybe the quiz time and the submission dates might influence this. And Lauren asked the assessments, yes, they are done fully in the VLE. But in a way, in a way, it is interesting that in some of these designs, the VLE engagement follows exactly when the assessment patterns are, while in other designs, it is not highly clear cut. So the interesting thing, of course, is, okay, what could be the underlying reason for that? So um, what I'm trying to get at is, like, if you look at just VLE engagement, the pictures become really messy. But if you link that with what teachers are designing, you can start to see what is happening. So, for example, the next slide, there's a health and safety warning. These are the VLE engagements of 73 modules, and this looks like a complete mess. If you just purely just look at the VLE activities of students over time, I mean, there's one big blur of data. So without actually then knowing how teachers are designing these courses, it's just one big mess. But the nice thing, of course, is with this learning design, we can start to see, okay, is there actually a link between how teachers are designing courses and what our students are actually doing? So the next slide, and I do apologize, this is a little bit of stats, is we can start to see, okay, which activities actually drive VLE engagement in our courses. And what you see here is a regression table where we've looked at the level of study that students were into from level 0 to level 3, the respective faculty that students were studying in, business, law, etc., the size of the module, and these 7 learning activities where we took assimilative as the benchmark. And what we find, quite interestingly, is that the level in which we are teaching significantly influences the kind of engagement of our students. And at the same time, as I think somebody mentioned before, there are significant disciplinary differences. So the way how our teachers are designing courses influences what our students are doing. But the best predictor, in a way, for whether students are engaged online, and I'm not saying that engagement, I think Matthew said it before, engagement doesn't necessarily mean learning. but at least in terms of just purely spending time online, we find that the best predictors are when teachers are including communication in terms of their design, and whether they included experiential activities. So where you're actually experiencing like doing this kind of productive activities of what's it called, of doing the programming task is a kind of experiential activity. So we did then follow-up research, which has just been published last week, and I do apologize if the font size doesn't seem to be very, very good. But what we did in comparison to the previous study, which was published last year, here this study is basically across an aggregate across 41 weeks, and we then did follow-up analysis on a week-by-week basis. And the week-by-week basis shows a really interesting picture, is that the way how our teachers are designing courses, if you see the R squared below on the right hand side, is for 69% predictive of what our students are doing. In a way, if you think about this is in a way an amazing result. So the way how our teachers are designing courses has a 69% link with what our students are actually doing, and the key driver for how that is linked is whether or not we include communicative activity. So on the one hand, this is great because we can see, okay, if we can influence what our students are doing by our learning design, if we can see that things are not working, we can also change them. So I'm just reading the question of Nikki. Would inclusion and be that more? Yeah, that is a question. Let's hold that question for a bit, because I think some of it we will come later to. So the next question, and this also links to a previous question, I think from I'm not sure, from Matthew. Sorry, I'm I'm trying to keep up with your chat, so just keep them going. This is cool. So then we looked at, okay, what do students actually like in terms of student satisfaction? So at the end, we do a typical student's evaluation of what they liked, and we then link that to learning design. And what we found was, yes, there are differences in terms of the levels in which they were studying, and we found that 6 out of the 7 learning design activities displayed here have an influence on their satisfaction. And quite surprisingly, if courses had lots of finding information and lots of productive activities and lots of assessments, students didn't seem to really like that at all. And this, of course, then raises a question: if students don't like that kind of design, what do we do? Actually, the best predictor, was the benchmark variable, which was assimilative. So if there were lots of assimilative questions, assimilated designs, the teachers were more likely to, the students were more likely to actually enjoy this. And I'm aware of time, so I'm just going to whiz through. But if we look at retention, the best predictor is actually whether or not teachers included communication in terms of the design. So what you get is this lovely visualization where we find an interesting tension, where students seem to like the traditional constructivist learning designs with lots of stuff, lots of content. But the best design in terms of student retention at the Open University seems to be designs where there is more the social constructivist design. What is quite interesting is that communication seems to be the best predictor for student retention, but at the same time, it has a negative relation between student satisfaction. And quite interestingly, there doesn't seem to be a relation between student satisfaction and student retention. So yeah, the question in a way, as Matthew posed it, is like, okay, what should we focus on? Should we focus on the simulative because it's easy, or should we focus on making the students do actual cognitive work? So what we did in follow-up research is then to see, okay, can we actually change teachers? I'm not saying that we should change teachers just for the sake of changing, but can we change the way how they design courses? So what we did was with 80 teachers, we basically allowed them to work in workshops. And we basically allowed them to work in, to come up with the best designs possible. And for 80 different teachers, we actually also then provided visualizations of their initial designs and also some insights from our research of what we found. And there is a quite striking effect, and I'm sorry if I whizzed through this because I'm a little bit aware of time, is that if you give teachers visualizations of their initial designs, and if you inform them a little bit more about what our students are actually doing, we can significantly change how our teachers are designing courses. So the people in the post-learning design, they were significantly focusing less on this assimilative activities and increased more interactive activities like finding information and communication. I should have explained that a 1% increase in communication at the Open University leads to a 0.5% increase in retention. So a move from 5 to 10% could lead to a substantial increase in retention, but also I think a much more enjoyable learning experience in the longer term for our students. So the next question that, of course, you can start to do is to see, okay, what are actually students clicking on a week-by-week basis? Because thus far, I've only showed you kind of aggregate data on a very crude level. But what we can also start to look at is what kind of activities our students are actually clicking on a week-by-week basis. And this is a kind of heat map of what excellent students are doing. And if you compare this with students who potentially are failing, and I'm going to whiz a little bit between those two, what you see is that, first of all, excellent students engage with the materials much more, but more importantly, they engage with these materials at an earlier stage. So I will come back to the question of Lauren in a minute. Thank you for raising the question. So how we calculate excellent and failing students, and the next slide again is a health and safety warning. It looks really scary. Is we use a fantastic system called OU Analyze. And with OU Analyze, we have different approaches to see what kind of activities our students are doing. In this case, it's Bayesian modeling, and where we basically, in this model, we can see, if we look at the left, did a student click on a particular forum in that week? Did a particular student click on a forum and some structured content? And the third blob is, did the student do nothing? And what we can start to see is, by looking at what students were actually engaged with on a week-by-week basis and what they clicked or what they importantly didn't click on, we can see which paths to Rome actually lead to success. And by using these predictive analytics models at the Open University, we can then see, okay, which students are following paths that could lead to success and which students are not following those paths. And I think it is important to say that there are multiple paths to Rome. It doesn't mean that there's only one path that leads to success, which I think you can quite nicely see on the bottom. After 5 weeks, there is an assessment, and lots of arrows go to the green line, and there are some arrows that go to the red line. And what is interesting is that if you compare this with another module, the predictive analytics has a completely different path. So every module will lead to slightly different routes to Rome. And this is, of course, very interesting. And what we then can start to do is we can build amazing visualizations to our teachers. So what you see here is a visualization of the kind of activities that that students are doing on a week-by-week basis, and then you can see which of those students we predict are at risk and which students we predict are not doing so well. And a teacher then has the opportunity at University to click on a respective student and see what that student is actually doing. And this is a visualization here. And then the teacher can see, okay, why is that student flagged at risk? And what kind of recommendations do we then give to students? And in a way, this is kind of learning design, learning analytics plus version, because we're combining all that data about how teachers design courses with what students are actually doing. So then the question is, okay, what would happen if you then would give this analytics data to teachers, you might ask? And what we did was we gave 240 teachers this learning analytics data in 10 modules, and 600 teachers decided they didn't want to use this for some reason or the other. They thought it was perhaps too scary. And the next slide, again, a health and safety warning, is a heat map of the actual engagement of teachers using this analytics system. And I apologize again because of the small font size. But what you see here is that in some modules, this predictive analytics were heavily used. So in the computing science module, which I explained before, which is on the bottom, they heavily used this analytics on a week-by-week basis. But at the same time, there were certain modules, like not to be shamed, the social science module, where only in week 15 or 14, only half of the teachers started to look at OU Analyze. So the next question, of course, is, okay, does this matter if you give teachers this analytics data, and will it help our students? And I'm aware of times I'm rounding up a little bit. I do apologize if I go a little bit too fast. So what we then did was to link what the characteristics were of students, and we linked what the characteristics were of the teachers, and whether or not they actually engaged with the analytics and how the module was designed. Quite strikingly, what we found, or in a way it was not striking, but the best predictors to pass the course were previous scores of students, which is kind of logical, right? I mean, if you do well on the previous module, you probably will also do well on the next module. But the second best predictor, and this is in a way very surprising to us, is that the second predictor was whether or not the teachers used our learning analytics platform, OU Analyze. So in a way, this to us was very surprising, because why would it be the case that a teacher who is in a way 2 or 3 steps removed from the learning journey of the students, why would, whether or not they influence, whether they use the system, why would that influence retention? I think what this hints at is this is a really nice illustration of, if we empower teachers to actually use this analytics, we can actually help to potentially better support our students and help them to pass. So I'm aware of times, so I'm just whizzing through the conclusion. So I think what I've tried to show you today, at least at the Open University, is that I think learning analytics can really enhance and facilitate the teaching practice. So by visualizing what students are doing on a week-by-week or day-by-day basis, we can actually help our teachers to design well, hopefully good learning designs. At the same time, what I think you've probably have seen is that there's a tremendous variation in how teachers design courses, but also there's tremendous variation in terms of how they use analytics. And quite interestingly, from our qualitative research, there seems to be a kind of lack of consensus about the intervention strategies. So what I think, I mean, the nutshell of my presentation is what I hopefully have shown to you today is that the way how our teachers design courses strongly influence what our students are doing. And it strongly also influences the satisfaction and performance. And by just visualizing the learning design decisions to teachers and visualizing learning analytics data, we can actually help teachers to change their practice, which I think is an amazing opportunity. At the same time, what is really nice is that we can use learning analytics to ask fundamental questions about which theoretical designs work best for our students, or which approaches work best for our students. But the biggest challenge, which we haven't really addressed, is, okay, but how do we then give this information to students? Because at this moment in time, this is primarily driven towards our teachers. So with that, with 2 minutes late, I'm looking forward to any remaining questions. So thank you very much for sticking with me, and I do apologize that I whizzed through a large amount of work, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Bart. That was really interesting. I noticed there's been a few questions that have come up in the feed towards the end there. So maybe if you wanted to go back to Matthew Hillier's question about the PD that teachers get about using OU Analyze.
Yeah, that is a very good question. The professional, I mean, I'm assuming PD, I mean professional development. So what we did was, of course, we trained those 240 teachers in how to effectively use those analytics. So they weren't bombarded with, hey, this is a visualization, and you know, you go ahead and you do it. And there were two so-called super users. These were tutors who had used OU Analyze before, and they were basically the kind of buddies that helped the tutors with trying to interpret this data. At the same time, there is a massive piece of work to be done, because we only convinced 240 out of the 800 teachers to work with the system, and many teachers were quite reluctant to use it. And more importantly, as you can also see from the heat maps, even if we gave teachers access to analytics data, many of the teachers didn't engage with that. So the fundamental question is, how can we ensure that we use the power of analytics to the best of the abilities? And I think that's a big, big, big question. So are there any other questions that you want me to focus
Fantastic.
on?
Yeah. Just going down now. Sorry, I should actually introduce at this stage Hazel, who has been looking at the chat log here. So, Hazel, is there anything in particular that you picked up that you'd like Bart to come back to before we open for more questions here at the end?
Thanks, Linda. I'm just going back through the list now. There was Matthew's question about whether we're looking at satisfaction and retention versus student learning was one, and then there was one from Nikki. I'm just finding that. Would the conclusion be that the more immersion the learning is, the more engagement we get from students? I think that one was partly addressed. One from Lauren asking about how the excellent and failing students were calculated in the heat maps. And then Matthew's about the staff development.
Yes. Yeah. So
Yeah, there's also,
Bart,
there's also very
any of those particular questions.
Yes, in a way, if we think about the immersive experience, I think what our research quite nicely shows is that if we, in a way, force between brackets our students to actively engage online, either with finding information or working together with peers or doing productive activities, that eventually leads to longer term gains in terms of retention and longer term progression. But at the same time, many of our students don't necessarily like this. And part of it could be is that many students decide to study at the Open University because they think it is an individual study. So I think one of the things we have to convince our students in terms of managing their expectations is, if we can see that particular learning designs are in the long term better for students, we have to then communicate, yes, you have to work very hard, and yes, you have to work with peers, but in a way, in the longer term, that might be the best for your studying. And an alternative way, which links, I think, to a quite nice question, I sort of word flexibility. Yeah, by Tash, the question in a way is, why are we providing only one version of the course to our students? You could also imagine, and I think that's the next frontier, what would happen if you design different learning designs and students can select the kind of learning design that meets their own needs? Or alternatively, how can you allow students to design their own kind of course that allows them to be more flexible? Because of course, this learning design forces teachers to teach in a particular way, which might not necessarily be flexible. So thank you, Tash, for raising that question. Maybe if I pick up the question of Maria, how does the OU approach student privacy and student data? I think I can be, I always say I'm proud of the Open University because we were the first university in the world to have an ethics policy on learning analytics. So we are very clear and open and upfront what we do with analytics. Our students, when they sign up for the Open University, we make it very explicit that we're using their data to improve their learning experience. And what we basically do is, this is not a kind of fixed thing that they give, sign over a blank check and then we just use whatever data they collect. We have very clear, strict regulations. And at the same time, every year, the experts in the Open University on ethics and learning analytics basically meet up and discuss together with representatives from students whether the data that we're collecting is still fit for purpose and appropriate. So there's a continuous dialogue whether our ethics policy is still in place and is appropriate. And I think I appreciate that, and when I give this talk to other countries, is that the local legal system will heavily influence how we're using learning analytics. So Hassie, I'm just picking up the question of Nikki and Hassie, are you standard on privacy changed over the years?
There's a follow-up question on privacy there.
Go.
Oh no, I was just saying that there was a question there that carries on from that.
Okay.
So you've obviously seen that one.
Yeah. So in a way, I mean, one of the things which we haven't changed, but in a way some people indicate we maybe should change. So the OU has clearly stated that what happens on social media is the student space. But increasingly, our students are using Facebook and whatever WhatsApp media to help to learn. So some of our teachers were saying, but okay, shouldn't we then start to also include some of those conversations? Because some students are not aware that there are amazing communities on Facebook that help. But thus far, we haven't changed our perspective that much. We primarily have focused more on the underlying variables that we're using, but we haven't necessarily changed a lot. But it could well be that maybe some part of this research could inform that. And Helen asked about, have you shared predictive analytics with your students? In a way, yes, because of course, when our teachers are then communicating with our students, they are not going to say to you, "Hey, Helen, you have a 62% chance of passing." If and it was 72% before. What they will say is, "Hey, Helen, hope you're right. We've noticed that you haven't logged in last week. Are you right?" So, in a way, we are of course communicating the analytics results in a kind of polite, polished way to students, but we would never say, "Hey, you're flagged as red and you have no chance of passing." So it's always kind of a more kind of pastoral, supportive role. And we're looking in 2018 to start to visualize to give these visualizations to students in a more polished form in a pilot environment. So I'm hoping that maybe next time when you invite me in a couple of years' time, we can then actually see, okay, how does this actually, how do students actually experience it? Because I think in terms of this holy grail of learning analytics, we have to close that loop and actually share this with our students.
That's wonderful, Bart. I think, Hazel, we should just note down that Bart's just volunteered to come back again in a couple of years' time. But what I'd like to come back to something that was raised just as you were finishing off your slides, and that is the question around. So there are a couple of people that were talking about the issue of what the teachers are doing with this data, the workload and the implications around that. So I noticed that you have some more quantitative statistics about what they've been using, where they've been using it and when they've been using it. But have you got any plans at the OU to actually do some perhaps more qualitative research to look at some of the experiences that teachers have?
Yeah, that is a very good question. So if you Google Thea Herodotto, who basically is in this slide, we also interviewed over a dozen teachers about their actual practice of using these analytics. And many teachers, in a way, were quite surprised about the initial outcomes of the predictive analytics results, because they, for example, would knew Marie, and they would have never predicted that Marie was suddenly at risk. And then if the system says Marie is at risk, hey, you have to perhaps have a conversation with Marie. Many teachers were initially quite skeptical towards the kind of, computer telling what the students were doing. But over time, teachers started to develop a kind of way of working that allowed them to have those kind of conversations with their students. But at the same time, many of the teachers then said that, okay, when I then finally called Marie, she already said, well, I deregistered 2 weeks ago because I couldn't keep up with the workload, or I had a bereavement in the family, so I have to stop my study. So the interesting thing in a way is that the kind of window of opportunity to have the conversations with our online learners is quite tight and short. So the difficulty in a way is, okay, how can we on the one hand encourage our teachers to look at this kind of data on a frequent basis, but also allow them to translate this data in terms of their own mental models and what they know about their students, because sometimes, of course, our analytics might indicate a student that read, but a teacher would know, oh yeah, that student is, John is just going on a holiday for 4 weeks, and thus the system might pick up that John hasn't logged into the environment, but actually that's perfectly fine because I know that John will catch up once he comes back from Australia. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I think between us, and I know we're being recorded, so I have to be careful what I say, but I think there is a big kind of effort needed to convince teachers that this data is useful, but it's not the end all of everything. So I think we need, probably more than ever, we need teachers that can see this as an opportunity. But without the teachers, the system is in a way useless, because we need to have that kind of conversation with the students. Yes, so I agree with Matthew. There needs to be human touch. So maybe if I pick.
That's fantastic. I was wondering if you'd like to come back to Stuart's question from CSU.
What's his question? Okay, yeah.
Can you see that one?
Yeah. So that's a very good. That's my own hobby horse.
About student self-disclosed data. Yes.
Yeah. So the dispositional. So in other publications with my partner in crime at Maastricht University, we do a lot of research on dispositional data and about students' motivation and emotions and their learning strategies, and that highly relates to what they're actually doing. And we're saying that one of the crucial ways to solve the kind of problem of giving information to students in terms of analytics is we have to understand their dispositions. So if I'm a quite anxious student, then getting a message, hey Bart, you're 2 weeks late and you're very far behind, might not actually be very motivating for me. But if I'm a bored student, or if I'm a lazy student, that same message might potentially give me, an incentive to do something. So this dispositional data and this self-disclosed data is really powerful. But at the Open University at this point in time, I'm just being direct here, we don't necessarily use that. And in part, it's just due to the sheer size of the organization that we don't use this. And even if we have that data at this moment in time, we don't have necessarily the infrastructure and expertise and time to actually do something with that data. But I think this is work, and hopefully in progress, that we can work towards over the next couple of years, because I think it is essential that we listen to the student voice and their perspective.
Fantastic. I think Maria also had a question about learning design taxonomies.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So what we, for some of the activities like assimilative, we have clear kind of guidelines. Okay, so many words is so many minutes of reading, and so many words with a complex vocabulary is an additional reading, or so many words with mathematical equations might take students longer. So we have, for certain activities, we have very clear taxonomies that we can also empirically then test whether, if you have a piece of 1,000 words, does it indeed take you, let's say, 45 minutes to read that 1,000 words. For other activities, like, for example, communication, we don't really have a strong proxy of, okay, what is communication? So we're now having a conversation for an hour. I mean, how would you capture that? So one of the things that we're currently also investigating is how can we make sure, given that communication seems to be such an important mediator for success, how can we be sure that if a teacher says it's 4% of your time you spend on communication, what does it actually mean? So we definitely need to unpack that further. So maybe in 2 years' time I can come back and show you some more research on that as well. So thank you for that question, Maria.
Fantastic. Well, I think due to time, we probably should draw the questions to a close there, but there was some really fantastic discussion, certainly in that last part and throughout the whole presentation. So I'd like to thank you again, Bart, for your really wonderful insight into all of the things that are happening at the OU and in learning analytics more broadly. I'd also like to thank all the participants for coming and also staying with us. There's quite a few of us still here online. Before we finish, I just want to highlight the next webinar that we'll be having as part of this Learning Analytics Special Interest Group. It will take place on the 18th of October, and the presenter for that webinar will be Dr. Anisha Bakaria from the University of Queensland. Anisha, for some of you who may know, she's been involved in building a lot of the fairly famous or certainly interesting learning analytics tools that have been used across the world, things like the Snap tool, the Loop tool, and she's developing another suite of really interesting things for MOOCs at the moment. So she's going to be talking about some of the tools that she's been involved in building, and some of the theories and ideas and designs behind those, and where that work might go in the future. So I'd really encourage you to come along to that one. I think there'll be a lot of really interesting stuff, very future forward looking as well. So as you can see in the chat there, Bart, everyone's saying thank you very much, and I join them. So thanks a lot, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you again next month. Thanks.